So I am so excited about this panel because I know each of these individuals, I know how brilliant they are, and we've had some conversations about this topic, in some cases over years. And so I know how great this is going to be. So I'll start off just by letting each of you introduce yourselves a little bit. Darian, you want to start?
Hi. I have to turn something on. Hello. Or speak loudly. There we go. Hi. I'm Darian Hunt, and I'm a senior interaction designer at Bank of America, and I'm currently leading the UX effort to build our first AI-powered digital financial assistant, which is going live in December. And I've been at the bank for about 10 years, and historically on various innovation teams, so this topic is near and dear to my heart because I spent a lot of time thinking about going from innovation to execution and have been part of different teams trying different things at the bank. And now that I'm part of this Erica initiative, it's really exciting because that's a perfect example of what we actually did, what started in an innovation lab and is now turned into a real-life project. And so the journey on that is really an interesting one that I'm hoping to share some of the things that I've learned along the way.
Okay.
How's that? My name is Jen Fabrizzi. I work for Travelers. I'm a director of strategy and research for the centralized design team. I've been there about 4 months. We're working on standing up and operationalizing a design team that kind of has grown over the years and now has many disparate designs and design styles throughout the company. So we're looking to develop a platform for designers to use to create more consistent and effective designs across the organization. It's echoing too much. And before that, I was a consultant with Slalom Consulting, consulting with different financial services and insurance companies in their efforts to bring outside-in thinking to design and to their product development efforts. I've also been on an innovation team, so this is also very near and dear to my heart, as Adam knows. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think this panel will have some good things to talk about, I think.
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm the design thinking guy where I work. So my focus has been trying to get folks to talk to customers before they build stuff and make that easier, which I would say right now where I work is kind of not as easy as it could be. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say about stuff. So.
All right, so for an opening question, I guess, kind of just widen things out here a little bit. I'd be curious to hear, like, in your respective positions, what do you feel like the biggest challenge for you has been, or your organization has been, in terms of, making design or innovation really work, really bringing it to execution? Anybody want to start?
I'll start.
Yeah.
From my short time at Travelers, I think one of the problems is cultural, actually. There's a lot of, this is how we do it here, this is the way we've always done it. The organization is trying to adopt an agile approach that's called SAFe. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's the Scaled Agile Framework. It's a daunting framework to your discussion about frameworks. It's not the only thing that the organization needs to kind of help it change. So what we're seeing is that it's more about behaviors. Not so much that the team members on the product teams don't want to do the right thing and understand their customers, but really there's a lot of kind of influence from senior leadership that isn't aligned with that goal. I'm trying to say that politely.
Jason?
Okay. I think right now probably one of the more difficult things is just where I work is sort of wrapping our arms around what do we build versus what do we buy. Mm-hmm. I don't think we build enough of our own things to really say we own this and feel ownership over it. I think also another issue is that it's difficult to know who your end user, your customer is, or differentiate between the two because it's not always the same group of people or person. I think that is probably a couple of bigger hurdles we have right now.
All right.
So I would say at the bank, which is a very large, siloed organization, we have matrix teams that do communicate. But on the whole, it's the organizational structure, which is very traditional, top-down, hierarchical, I think works really well for things that don't change very quickly. So historically, when you're trying to bring a product to market and you have time and the markets don't change and the product is not going to change substantially from the time you start planning it to the time you execute on it, those types of decision-making structures, the hierarchy works really effectively and it definitely has its place. But I think when you're trying to really be innovative and create change, they kind of work against you because decision-making going from the top down doesn't always encourage innovative thinking, because the people who are actually trying to solve the problems a lot of times are on the ground, whether they're a lot of times they're designers, because we're talking to people who are actually experiencing our products and we have a direct relationship with the user and we know a lot about them. And I think it's the further you go up the hierarchy, the further that separation is. So I think it just gets more and more challenging to make those connections. So when you're on the ground and solving problems, you have all these ideas, but then trying to bubble those ideas up is really challenging, I think. And then you create these groups that focus on innovation, but then the teams who actually have to execute them don't feel like they're the ones who are owners of that idea, and it creates a lot of disconnects. So I'd say that's structure and hierarchy don't really lend themselves to innovation that well. I mean, there's different ways you can organize it to make it work, but it's...
Can I add one more thing to that? I think off your point is that a lot of times the frameworks that are being used allow for that to happen. But if the behaviors aren't there, if there's not an understanding from product management or the team or senior leadership, whoever might be involved, that they can bubble those ideas up, that gets to empowerment, that it just doesn't happen, even if the framework allows for it.
So the way I'd love to do this is keep this open to audience participation. So if any of you have questions, I know it's still early in the morning and brains probably aren't functioning quite at their peak just yet. But if anybody has a question, please feel free, raise your hand, and we'll, I don't know if we have an extra mic, but we'll allow you to scream. Yes?
I'll try to squeeze. Hello, Marina Dean, welcome to World Banking. I heard some of you have innovation labs in your organization. So as you start developing these structures, what is the first step? And in a way, what is the prioritization and sequencing of building it up and incorporating it into the organization?
Great question. So what's the first step in building an innovation lab or some kind of structure like that, do you think? Jason, you run one, so.
Well, I'm part of one. I don't run it. I've been a part of a few now, and I think, well, I don't want to end around your question, but I do want to bring up one thing, right? I think probably one of the more pressing issues, right, is not necessarily getting the lab up and running, but I do think it is how do you bring the mindsets that lab is using out into the business and let them feel that way too. And I think it kind of comes back to mindset and then framework. I think a lot of times we rely on frameworks to say, like, here's how you do it. Now just go do it. But we don't necessarily put enough effort into saying, like, you're allowed to feel differently or think differently about how you're executing or what you're doing. It's okay to make mistakes, things like that. I mean, we say it, but it's hard to really do it. Like, celebrate failure is a wonderful thought, but it's really hard to get people to say, like, I blew it, It's hard, right? So I think that's part of it. I think also this innovation lab thing is like, you take a bunch of folks, you give them a different set of rules maybe, you give them a cool looking space, and then you put them in this little hermetically sealed bubble where no germs can get to them, and you make it really safe for them, and then nobody can figure out why everybody hates you. So I would say another thing is just to keep in mind that, like, the lab shouldn't be it shouldn't be totally safe. It should be like, you should remind folks, like, I play by the same rules you do. I don't have different legal risk compliance people that I'm talking to get my stuff done faster. It literally does not work that way. So I think that's the other thing, is just making sure that, like, you're really open and honest about how we're not very different. We're just trying to do things a little differently, and you should too. At least that's the message I try to send. I don't believe in the hamster bubble of innovation labs so much anymore.
So when I was on an innovation team, we tried to do what you said, which was to bring the goodness of a lab to teams. So we would actually do a lot of coaching, not so much training, but kind of boots on the ground coaching for outside-in thinking. One of the biggest problems we had with teams was their rush to solve things, as opposed to sitting with that little nagging anxiety that's there before you know that you've got the design concept first forming. Getting people comfortable with that feeling of being uncomfortable was really important. And the other thing that we tried to do that I can't say we succeeded at, but I think it's still a viable hypothesis, if you will, is that we were looking at organizations as learning structures. And so a lab culture could, if it's just a bubble that never sees any other people come in and out of it, it doesn't work because it's so, what's the word I'm looking for, incestuous after a while, that you don't have any new ideas coming in. So the hypothesis that we had at the time was to have it be like a rotational thing where people from product teams would be able to come into the innovation lab, work with people who that's their passion, and understand what we now call design thinking a little bit better. So, like I said, I can't say that we made that successful, but I like the idea of rotations if you're going to do that.
I would agree with that. I think, and I've been on both types of teams, where we keep them hermetically sealed, and sometimes you think that that's the only way you're going to get something done, but I think the challenge there is that the innovation team is creating these really wonderful ideas. It's really fun. You go out, you prototype, you test, you end up with a really great product, but then no one feels like they were part of it, and so. And when it comes time to actually building the thing, that's when all the constraints come in. And so much of design is about negotiating those constraints, whether they be technical constraints, whether they be legal risk compliance constraints. And if you take away those constraints, any work coming out of an innovation lab can be very inspiring, but it's really hard to turn them into an actual reality. And I think the designers in our group on the ground actually doing execution work rarely have the time to build innovation into their work stream. So that's really the challenge, and that's why we ended up building these innovation teams, but it creates this really odd dynamic. And I think what's interesting, what we're trying to do now with the Erica project, which is the name of this product that we're building, that came out of the innovation lab. That was just this idea that was sitting there, and suddenly when we started building an Alexa skill, that negotiation went that got shelved, but we ended up saying, well, Alexa, that's just a skill that you can talk to, but what if we created something that you can actually engage with on glass and speak to and text? And so then we got an organizational champion who decided to put a lot of money into this. So we had money and we had 9 months to build this brand new platform. And I think we had two things going for us from an innovation perspective, is that one is that we had very little time to build this thing. I mean, we weren't even given a choice. Nobody asked, can you do this in 9 months? It's like, you got 9 months. You got to do this, and the other advantage is that no one knew anything about how to go about doing this. So what's interesting about that, though, is that suddenly you're faced in a situation where you actually have to execute on an idea, you have very little time, and you've got to figure out how to do it, and no one can tell you how. So what's fascinating about that is that suddenly you've got this sort of organic, sort of team-building effort, and you start to see, interestingly enough, like we went from 2 designers to now we've got a team of 39, including product partners, and we've organically grown this, and what's fascinating is that what started out with, from my perspective as a designer, I was very interested in the actual product itself, like what goes into the product, all the different UX pieces of a text bot. But what ended up happening as our team grew is I became more and more interested in what you're doing, is sort of how do we set up our team in such a way that we can continue to innovate as we execute? And so what's interesting is that we actually, as we're designing and we're dealing with all these constraints with our dev partners, they're like, well, no, we can't do this, or we don't have time to do this, or there's, it's not in scope. What I'll do is I'll tell our designers, we have a weekly meeting where we all the FXDs and the ideas get together, and we're like, what is it that we want to improve? And it's turned into a little bit of a mini innovation pipeline where the innovation and the thinking comes from the teams that are actually executing, but it's like all the things they would like to do but can't for whatever reason, dev, and then we start to fix and improve things that we want, and we put them in a backlog and that would then go into the product eventually. And then they feel empowered, I think, to make changes and so it's interesting because it's the first time that I've actually been on a team that does both an innovation product and bring it to life and execution, but also try to build innovation into that product itself as part of the execution routine. So I find that's so far, and we're still learning because we haven't, we're still figuring it out, but so far that's actually been the most successful combination that I have seen of how to get innovation and execution sort of connected, as opposed to in a separate group.
So it sounds like a level of autonomy is kind of a big driver of that, right? It's a big enabler, right?
Oh, well, my favorite word, because autonomy is an interesting idea, right? Because we're in autonomy is, I try to create as much autonomy for my designers so that they can make their own decisions, which sort of brings back, I think, this conversation around collaboration, because collaboration, to me, is not just about sharing ideas, right? I think a lot of people think of collaboration as the sharing of ideas. That's critical. But what I'm looking at is like, who's making the decisions? Because there's a big difference between sharing ideas and making a decision. And what I try to do is allow my team to make as many decisions as possible. And if you think about it, really, there's two types of decisions, right? There's decisions that you can't reverse, that are like serious and important decisions that you need a lot of information to make. And then there's like most like 90% of decisions, and when you're building digital project, maybe like 95% of the decisions are reversible, right? You make a decision about a product, and if you've got really fast production cycle, you put it out there, and then if it doesn't work, you fix it. And it's not that, it's not terrible. So I find that if you can empower teams and designers, especially who are on the ground, to make decisions, especially these non-reversible decisions, it makes them feel a lot better about getting stuff done. And then we leave the more important irreversible decisions to leaders who have much more, they have more information, they have a larger worldview about what's going on in the organization, and they're the ones who are putting the money there, so they need to make those. But I mean, I think the challenge for me is sort of figuring out that balancing act, right? Like, a lot of people on the leadership level want to make those sort of type 2 reversible decisions, and that ends up slowing down the process tremendously. So a lot of my job is trying to protect my team so that they can go and get work done quicker, and then I try to manage up and sort of articulate those decisions and why they were made.
And Jen and Jason, what have your experiences been around kind of empowerment, autonomy, decision making? What have you tried? What do you think works?
Well, I agree with the idea that you can help your team by empowering them to make decisions. In our context at Travelers, where I'm kind of leading a portion of the design team, the leadership team is talking about this kind of thing all the time. How do we give our team members who are out working on product teams, so it's this matrixed organization, touching on the silos that you talked about, how do we help those team members to feel empowered when they're working on release trains or product teams that, the team members aren't all empowered either. So it's difficult. I think autonomy is a good thing, but I think it's not individual autonomy. It's autonomy as a team, and how do you influence, the people that are kind of keeping you from having that autonomy. It's bigger than just the individual. Mm-hmm.
Because for autonomy to work, you need transparency. Those people need to have as much information available as possible, and a lot of these organizations, that information doesn't always trickle down, so then the designers on the ground don't have the information they need to make those decisions, and that's not empowering. So
I'd also say that some of the decisions that the team thinks they are making get changed by people outside the team without their knowledge sometimes, or they hear about the change after the fact. So that's not real autonomy at all. So.
Yeah, I think autonomy is sort of a style thing, I guess. Like I try to provide as much to my team as possible myself. And I think about like really great managers and leaders that I've had in my life, and they will give me a mission and say, here's your mission, go execute it, and I'm here to help and support, but I'm not going to give you tasks. So I try to do that, and then I try to manage up in the same way to say, like, don't tell me what to do, tell me what you want, and I'll figure out how to do it. And, you know, trust is a big part of that, and transparency, all the other things you mentioned. But I do think to some degree you have to find the right folks that are going to be okay saying, I don't exactly know what he's doing today, but I kind of know what he's trying to get done. And that can be hard for a lot of people, especially in a big company where you're not always sure what it is you do. Sometimes what you do is know what other people do and then have meetings to talk about it with other people that are paid to know what other people do. And I think it's like kind of comes back to the org thing. Like, how do you just let everybody know? It's okay, if you trust me to do my job, I swear I'll do it well.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, but yeah, you know, autonomy's a funny thing. It's like trust, you gotta earn it, I guess.
Hey, yes.
Yeah, so this is for Darian, maybe the whole panel, but so Erica was announced 9 months ago. I thought it was maybe longer than that. And there's been some skepticism because it's been so long since you've actually released it beyond just a small group of people. So how does that put pressure on you when it's already been announced, right? And it's not so much innovation. You said, "Yay, I failed," but you can't fail, right? So how does that kind of change the dynamics of, you know, you have this deadline that keeps, you're the first person from Bank of America that's put a date that I've heard so far. So congratulations on that.
No, I mean, Michelle Moore went up at Money 2020 last year, and she announced that we were going to launch Erica in 2017, third quarter. Well, we have launched her, actually. We're pilot launch. We have 800 associates now at the bank who are actually using her, and so it'll be released to the public slowly starting in December. So we did meet our deadline. It was 2017, and it was the Q3, Q4 of 2017. So it puts pressure on our team because we have no choice. Like, we can't say, no, we can't do this. The dev teams can't say, no, we're not able to do this, because we have to do it. There is no turning back. And so you end up having to make decisions that you don't know if they're the right decisions or they're not, right? You get a group of smart people together in a room, and we all discuss and deliberate, and then we make the decision that we think is best. But like I said, most of these decisions, other than, you know, how you're going to build your stack, are really reversible ultimately. So it's like, all right, well, we don't have time to overthink this, just do it, right? So things started moving really quickly that way, which was actually very refreshing. I thought that was a great way of moving forward on a project. I think if we were asked, okay, how much time do you think you need to do this? Oh, at least 2 to 3 years. And, you know, then we would have taken a lot more time. We would have done a lot more research. We would have done a lot of the things that you're supposed to do on a team, but we would not have been able to get it done and deliver it in the time that we did. And we needed to do that in order to be competitive. So.
Do you fear you're going to rush out of version 1.0 and it's just not going to be ready?
Oh, 1.0 is done, like delivered. Like, we're already working on version, like, we're already working on the third set of release features. So, and then we're retroactively going back and fixing a bunch of the stuff that we just didn't get right the first time, because that's just inevitable when you're working that quickly. So I think it's just getting the teams also comfortable with the idea that not everything is going to be perfect, right? And that's a hard thing to do as a designer, because you want everything to be perfect, and so you just got to get it out there. And that's been our best friend in some ways in terms of innovation and getting work done.
I'd like to add something to that as well. I think one of the challenges that we have in financial services is not just to change the culture of our development and product teams, but to change the way we think about product release. The idea of continuous release cycles, where we're releasing smaller and smaller pieces of value, or, you know, value streams or whatever, to the wild, if you will, is something that we don't do very well because of probably mostly because of the technology stack that we have. It's harder to do that, or at least we think it is. So one of the things that we're looking at is how do we change not just the way that product teams operate in creating new features and new products, but how do we get them to release, you know, in more of a continuous fashion?
So we had a question come through on Twitter around research. So just like we can silo developers and designers, we've seen organizations centralize research from design. And so just curious, you know, that central research hub versus individual product teams that own their own research and do it themselves. What are your pros or cons? What have you seen and experienced yourselves?
I'll jump in on that. So I'm actually grappling with that problem right now. New to Travelers and leading up the strategy and research team. And I feel very strongly about this. So this is just my opinion. So take it for what it's worth. But I really feel strongly that design and research, it's all design. And that once you take design research out of the design process like that and silo it, I think it creates a barrier that is somewhat artificial. So what myself and the other leaders of our experienced design team are talking about is how do we put more lean tools, to use a buzzword, but to put research capabilities in the hands of our designers who are on product teams, so they don't have this backlog of standing in line waiting for the research team to do their research. So for example, usability testing, if you consider that a form of research, I consider it a form of design or part of the design process. You know, right now what our teams do is they ask someone to do the research, set up the recruiting, and kind of conduct the testing sessions. Doesn't always happen that way, but when it does happen that way, there's a lag. So what we're trying to do is enable teams to kind of think that research is part of their work, and then also to facilitate their product teams through the learning process that goes on when you do user research, right? So if you've got a separate arm doing user research, how is that knowledge transfer going to happen on your product teams? So what we're trying to do is a staffing model where we have a lead experienced designer on a product team with some UI designers plus a researcher. If you need a separate researcher, it depends on the product that you're designing. But so that's our approach, is that it's got to be more integrated. If there are organizational silos that set up, that doesn't change the fact that the capabilities need to be integrated on a product team.
So this is also obviously very important to me because this is kind of what my thing is at work. So we don't have a big, huge design team. I think across the world, our company employs something like 40,000 people or something. I don't know. I see a familiar face. There's one of them. And we have like maybe a dozen designers, if that. So to me, user research is not even just for designers, it's got to be for everybody. So what we try to do is when we're partnering with a group of folks that are building something, we make the product owners do the research, we make the business analysts, anybody who's available who can go talk to customers. So it's really like for me, user research is a team sport. It shouldn't even be part of necessarily just the design mechanism. It should be the product mechanism to me. So, and plus, I think one of the other interesting things, and I feel like one of the messages around this 9-month thing is like design loves constraint. And if you put constraints like must be done in 9 months, it'll get done, and designers will be like, I'm going to turn this thing up to that other gear I have because they don't have a year, and they will, it'll fill the time you give them. So, so for me, one of the constraints is that we have nobody doing design necessarily, and therefore we have nobody doing specialized design tasks like you're a user researcher, you're a visual designer. We just don't have those people. So it's a team sport on a product team. And so that's what I try to kind of preach to these teams that are willing to kind of get on board with. I mean, my team's 6 people. So we can only handle a couple things at a time. But that's our message, is like, we're not going to do anything for you. We're going to enable you to do it yourself. That's why I chose that word in my title that I made up when I started this job. Enablement. I put that in there. Anyway, because we're just not big enough to do it for you.
Well, I think your two answers are really interesting, because I think it sort of goes to show, Adam, what you were saying is that there is no one right way to do it, I think. Every organization is different. They have different needs, different problems to solve. And like you solved it a certain way because of your constraints, you're solving it a certain way. At the bank, we've solved it, in a number of different ways. Some work, some don't. And they don't always not work for the same reasons. So you sort of have to understand what the issue is. If it's a communication issue across the research and the products, there's different ways to solve for that. If it's just a personnel issue, then you solve for it a different way. So I think part of what's exciting and interesting is that it's really up to us to sort of figure out, all right, what will work best for this organization within these constraints, and then the frameworks and the training and all that just help you come up with ideas. And then what I'll do with my teams is that I ask every one-on-one that I have with all my team members, both UX and product, is about once a month I'll check in with all of them individually, and I ask 3 questions. I'm like, what's working, what's not working, and what do you think can be done better? And it gets them thinking about, what actually is working. They have to actually think about it, and what's not. And then we talk together about what could be improved, and then I'm trying to remove the barriers, and then I take that information about what's working, and I transfer it to the other pods that we have working on different features. And that seems to be working really nicely too, because it gets changed to sort of stick. Because if something's working for a particular pod, we say, okay, I'll talk to another pod, be like, have you tried this? Or, this is working for them, do you want to give it a try? And if it might work, it might not, but I leave it up to them to sort of figure out what works, and that tends to be, it's been good.
If I could be a panelist for a second and just kind of add, I think the biggest thing for me with user research is the distance between the user and the team. And the user researcher or experience researcher, whatever we're going to call them, whoever's doing that research, they get the closest to the user, to the customer. They develop, in most cases, the strongest set of empathy because they're kind of the closest person in the game of telephone. And then to structure a project where that researcher walks away after the first 3 months because they've handed off their report, you lose a lot of that. No report, no journey map can ever really convey that sense of connection, can ever really duplicate that sense of connection. So to me, that understanding needs to be persistent throughout the effort. It can't just go away.
So I really have to add something to that because I really very much agree with that. And I think what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do anyway, with our designers and with the product teams that they're on, is to help them create an experience of design for their product teams. So it's research isn't a siloed thing. To your point, the product manager has to be involved in the research. I mean, if you look at the definition of a product manager, they're supposed to own that. They're supposed to understand the customer from the product team perspective, right? We help them do that. So it's a team sport and it's integrated because, to your point, the research and the empathy can't be removed from the team.
But I would argue that's not a structural question, right? I mean, when we do user research, we have a separate research group, and I encourage all the designers and all the product partners and whoever else is involved in the team to listen in and watch, because what you can see and what you actually read in the report can be very different. So.
More questions? Yes, in the back.
So I can probably just, you guys hear me?
Yep.
So a friend of mine likes to say, like, with innovation, we always are trying to like add something, right, to a big organization and to be successful. I'll just keep going. Often the trick is to figure out what to stop doing to make room for the new innovation. So I just wanted to hear if any of you had any stories where you had to kind of convince the organization to stop doing something so that you could execute an innovation, and what worked well to actually get people to stop.
That's a great question. Any takers?
Oh, wow.
All right, I've got one. All right, the single hardest thing for us to actually bring a product to market from innovation to execution is trying to remove the levels of decision makers between ourselves and the person at the top making decisions. And I think trying to appease their interest and curiosity in the project versus trying to get involved and making decisions which are not informed if they're not part of the actual on-the-ground work, that's been the single most challenging thing, is essentially the train is moving so fast, and in a large organization, the more people in the hierarchy that need to weigh in on something because they're responsible, so it's totally natural, this slows down the train. So it's not that it's bad, it's not that their input is not valuable, it is, but if you're not on the ground, part of the constant decision making and information sharing that's going on, it's a lot of work to try to inform everyone about every single detail of why a decision was made. So that's really time consuming, and I think removing those reviews with those, with people like that has been very challenging. We're very fortunate in that the person who's actually who's championing the project just said, once a week, you come and you give me a readout, right? And between us and her, there's no one right now. So that's been very, very helpful in trying to get stuff done because everybody has basically gotten out of the way. And so that's been challenging, but we still have our challenges there. There's still, people who want to get involved, but I think it's good, being able to manage it.
While you were talking, I was at first kind of flummoxed, like, oh my God, do I have an example of this? But then you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, here's an idea. This is zooming in at much lower level detail. So on a product team that I was consulting with once before Travelers, the team was really very much making this transition to Agile for the first time. And that affected not just the way they thought about the process, but also how they designed the user interface, right? And so when they talk about something, those of you in financial services, all of you will be familiar with the idea of a policy inquiry screen. And that is a typical term that business will use to refer to it. They're used to saying, okay, well, the policy inquiry data includes like 250 fields, and we just put it on the screen. So in kind of working with them, the question was, well, what do these users, these personas need right now in this task on the screen? And we came up with 7 fields or something, right? So in that sense, it's a very small example, but it's designed by subtraction, I guess, which I hope kind of sort of connects to your point.
So another question through Twitter. With regulations and launching products, marketing wants to be friends, and legal is ready for a fight. So how do you bridge that gap? And Jen, I know you and I faced this a number of times in the past.
Well, I'm not going to pretend to sit here and say that, I've always been successful in that battle. But I think what I can say is that you're better off not making it a battle. So I'll just tell one story, a success story dealing with legal and compliance on a screen design. This is, again, a very specific example where compliance wanted the wording to be, it's all the passive voice and it's sentences upon sentences. And basically what I did was I broke it down. I broke the language down and put it in active voice and realized there were basically 2 if-then statements in their compliance language. And I just designed it that way. I used information design to lay it out that way. So the point of what I'm trying to say here is that arguing with legal is not a way to go in my experience, but if you can show them how it could be different, but still get their goal across, like showing is just so much better than talking about it. That's true no matter what, but I've found that to be true in legal as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. I've had success by just bringing the legal folks along for the ride. So show them what design thinking is, show them what it means to interview a customer, try and get them to come and do it with you, talk endlessly to them about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then all of a sudden it becomes less a fight and a lot more of a we want to help you figure this out. Speaking to folks that are in risk and compliance and all this, they don't see themselves as the bottleneck. They really don't. In fact, they're just people and they just want to see successful things happen and make the people around them successful. I mean, they're not bad folks. It's usually the system that's the problem. And so, but the nice thing is that systems are usually just reinforced by people. So if a bunch of people say, oh, this is crap, let's change it, then everything starts to happen and everybody's like, oh, this is so much easier now, right? So, I was in a room with a bunch of very senior folks trying to figure out a big framework thing for how we fund big projects. And someone from Risk was like, well, it's not our problem. We're all about smooth sailing. We want to move fast. And the finance guy, and he's like, it's this guy, it's the finance guy. The finance guy's like, it's not me. I'm all about fast. You show me your numbers, I'll help you price it. Boom. It's not me, it's this guy. It's the IT guy. And the IT guy's like, what? It's not me. So you get all these people looking at each other saying, it's not me, it's you. And I'm like, well, if it's none of you, then let's just go faster, So I think that's the other thing is that if you stop pointing that finger and stop making it about it, it's not me, it's you. Right?
I have to add that I think in going to design conferences over the years, we've always said at these conferences, they don't get us. They don't get designers, but it wasn't until I started designing an ecosystem for development teams and started doing user research with developers and BAs and testers and, people on a product team, that I realized everybody was saying they don't get us. And that's the same thing, so you have to bring them along for the ride. It's not a fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they also believe that somebody else trying to do their thing for them. So the finance guy's like, don't price this. That's what I do. Just tell me what you want. I'll figure it out for you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Jason, what you were saying. I think there is this us and them mentality in a lot of these large organizations, and LRC was seen sort of that way. But when you meet with them and you talk to them and you walk them through your designs, you start to realize that their comments, they are on the same side as you. They're really there to protect the user from a lot of stuff going on, financially, and they're making sure that the bank doesn't get sued. They're really looking out for the end user, with pretty much all of their decision making. And when you start to realize that, you're like, oh, well, you're on our side. And okay, well, if we're looking out for the user, this is why we think this is not going to work. And what you're proposing is going to be a really bad user experience because it's going to look like this. And do you really like this? They're like, no, you're right. And then then you can negotiate and you realize there's actually a lot more wiggle room than you originally assume if you start having those conversations.
Yeah, I've always found it funny that designers complain about legal all the time, and I'll talk to organizations that are like, well, when do you bring legal and compliance in? Oh, we bring them in at the end. Well, why do you bring them in at the end? Because that's the way we've always done it. They're a review body. And it's like, okay, how many of you here have ever complained that somebody didn't bring you into a project earlier enough? Right. Like we do the same thing, right? And so a lot of the lawyers and the compliance folks that I've talked to, they hate the system. They're like, I hate being the last person because now I got all this pressure. I got to get this thing out the door. I don't have enough time to really understand things. So I'm going to write you 3 pages of disclosure text because it's the only way I know how to be safe. So, more questions? Got about 5 minutes left. So one of the topics that I've been very interested in, and it's come up a few times in conversation here, is the topic of frameworks. And kind of what works in frameworks and what doesn't work in frameworks. So I'd be curious about your experiences. What frameworks have you tried to be a part of? What frameworks have you seen successful? What have you picked out of frameworks? Any stories you'd like to share? I'll use frameworks very broadly.
I'm kind of old school. I like Scrum.
Yeah.
I think Scrum's dope. When done right and done efficiently.
Okay, you want to talk about old school?
No, not really, no. No, that one I don't like so much. Honestly, I mean, I think like right now where I am, I'm trying to talk to people about like mindsets first. So I think like one of the points you brought up, right, is that like the tools alone don't really do the trick. So you got to figure out like, why are you doing this? So, I've been sort of using this analogy where I work, where we're undergoing a big agile transformation right now, which is like, imagine 2 big Ferris wheels. And like you can't ride the blue one until you've ridden the green one, and the green one is discovery, like design thinking, like what are we doing? And now you've figured that out a little bit. Now go do the other one, which is building stuff with high efficiency. Right now we're sort of like we're just gonna go build stuff, but like why? For who? What's the problem you're solving? So even just getting folks to understand like you got to figure out who this is for and why you're doing it before you go off and lock yourself in a room for a year building shit. Sorry, it's early. So anyway, I mean, that's like what I've been trying to tell people is you've got to figure out what it is you're doing, and you got to talk to customers to make sure that you're on the right track, and it's cheap and easy. You just got to try it. So I guess that's not really a great frameworks answer, but I think honestly right now I'm trying to tell people don't worry about the framework.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point.
I've been working so long that I can't tell you all the frameworks, but definitely started with waterfall. Definitely lived through the agile transformation, and all the designers I knew were crying every day. It doesn't work, I can't do it. And now in our organization, the big framework is SAFE. And some of you may have heard of SAFE. Again, it's the Scaled Agile Framework. My thing on frameworks is not that a framework is the answer, but it's a scaffold for learning. And the most important thing to learn are the mindsets, the behaviors, the attitudes. Even in SAFE, You can have people go into their retrospectives, to their increment planning sessions, to their, all the ceremonies that are built into the SAFE process, if you will. But unless they've embraced the mindsets of Agile and Lean, which are the foundations of SAFE, it's not going to work. So it's really just a scaffolding for learning. And once people actually adopt the mindsets and the behaviors and the attitudes, then the scaffolding can begin to fall away. But it takes a long time for that to happen.
So I think of frameworks I think they're extremely useful. They're a little bit like religions, right? I mean, they're ideals. And if you follow all these rules and you really believe, and then yes, it can work great. But, I think that all religions are, like frameworks are all good, right? They all serve a very useful function. And I have found like the most successful implementation is just picking and choosing and figuring out what resonates for that moment in time, for that particular problem, and then you come up and you basically create your own framework for what works. So it's sort of a mixed bag, but I find that frameworks are incredibly useful for giving you ideas, and then you take what works, you throw out what doesn't.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you got as much out of this panel as I know I did. Thank you.